Hello everyone, Aimer back with another Mission Impossible episode review. This time we've got from the Revival, Season 2, Episode 11, which is called Deadly Harvest. So this one starts off in Kansas, according to the byline, where we see an elaborate laboratory and a guy named Jared doing some experiments on seeds. His girlfriend, Laurel, tries to get him away from his work, but Jared gets a call from a fellow named Youssef K., telling him that he's had some great success. Laurel picks up the phone to listen in as Youssef talks about a virus that he wants to unleash quickly. Jared sees Laurel eavesdropping. Laurel is furious that Jared's been lying to her about his motives, and a fight ensues with chemicals being thrown around and a fire starting. Laurel gets impaled on a piece of lab equipment, and Jared goes into a radiation chamber to retrieve some seeds. With her last step, Laurel shuts the door as the radiation starts, and Jared cries out in pain. Jim goes back to the zoo getting his disc player with the usual spy speak. The mission: Youssef K. is a minister in Orenbach and has plans to increase his country's power and his own personal power by causing mayhem, destroying the U.S.'s wheat harvest, and threatening to do so to other nations. Jared used the unsuspecting Laurel to help develop a virus capable of pulling it off, and the lab fire was the only thing that prevented the plan from starting. Jared suffered massive burns, and the IMF must destroy all information about the virus, which is currently in Orenbach. Nice touch there with the polar bear behind Jim. That was kind of cool. We have a proper apartment scene this time, indicating that Laurel's death has been kept a secret, and Shannon will take her place. And Youssef is on his way to the United States to retrieve Jared, who will become Nicholas. The IMF head to the hospital where Jared is recovering. Dr. Grant makes preparations, including anesthetizing the real Jared, and giving Nicholas a camera transmitter to use in his glasses. Youssef arrives early, so the IMF acts quickly to switch Jared for Nicholas. Grant shows Youssef the extent of the burns to prepare him for the fact that Jared will have a completely new face and voice. Youssef is surprised but is unwavering in his quest to get Jared back home right away. He meets Nicholas as Jared, who greets him warmly and introduces him to Shannon as Laurel. Youssef says he's under pressure to get their plan going. Nicholas tells him he'll have to start his work over, but can do so once back home. And he insists that Laurel come with him. Youssef doesn't like that, but under the circumstances has no choice but to agree. Off the group go to Orenbach at the research facility within a military compound. The rest of the IMF arrive separately and set up at some sort of closed building. Nicholas's bandages are removed, and Youssef is outraged, saying he's not Jared. But Nicholas shouts him down, putting on the glasses so that the IMF can see what's going on. Youssef is still shaken, but seems to accept what's happening. Nicholas and Shannon walk around the compound to relay footage to Grant, from which the team formulates a plan. While at dinner that evening, Youssef takes Nicholas's coffee cup to check the fingerprints. Fortunately, they do check out, as Grant had lifted them from Jared at the hospital. The next morning, Grant plays dead in front of a truck to get the driver to step out of it, then shoots him with the tranquilizer dart, allowing Max to get into the cab. They get into the compound using the truck, but are held for inspection by a mean-looking dude who we later learn is named Mukta, who uses a pitchfork to make sure nothing's hidden inside the cab. Somehow or other, Max manages to avoid getting poked and heads to try and find the lab. Grant deliberately stalls the truck near the exit, and as the crowd pushes to help out, he quickly heads into a tent with a computer, grabbing a disk with personnel files. In the lab, Jared reunites with his old colleagues, who of course don't recognize him at first, but Grant is able to relay names to Nicholas so that he can have proper conversations. This includes Mukta and also his old flame Ismahan, who is rather cold to Shannon for obvious reasons, even hinting she might provide her with some competition for the handsome Jared with the new face. The group heads to see the wheat samples, with Shannon staying behind in the lab to switch the virulent sample seeds with IMF fakes. And Grant warns her that there's a countdown between radiation blasts, so she has to be careful. Nicholas uses his glasses to help warn Shannon that Ismahan is coming back to the lab as she switches the petri dishes, but Ismahan notices the open door and shuts it as the seconds count down. Grant informs Nicholas, who feigns a headache, rushes back to the lab, putting a Bunsen burner under some wires to start a spark to distract the others so he can quickly open the door and save Shannon with a few seconds left. Max finds a fuel supply to the lab and plugs it into the sprinkler feed while Nicholas deletes Jared's research, and Youssef has a very uncomfortable conversation with General Hakim, who seems skeptical of his plan. Youssef tells Nicholas as Jared that he needs something to demonstrate by tomorrow, reminding him that while Jared may not be dispensable, Shannon as Laurel certainly is. Ismahan discovers that the research has been deleted and informs Youssef, who asks her to get the seeds so that he can at least show those to the general. But as she does so, he locks her in as punishment for her failure. Then takes guards to arrest Nicholas and Shannon, who are both roughed up a bit in anticipation of their military trial. Max gets into the wheat storage unit to plant a timing device, having to hide underneath the catwalk to evade Mukta, but not for long as Mukta actually saw him, and a pretty good boss fight ensues, ending with Mukta taking the long fall into the wheat pile. The timing device is destroyed in the fight, so Jim suggests rigging up a bucket which will slowly fill with gasoline until the time is right. The military court begins, and Jim arrives as a lawyer from Amnesty International. General Hakim allows him to speak with Nicholas, and Jim calls Youssef as his first witness, accusing him of perhaps projecting his own desire for financial gain on Jared. And then Shannon admits that Nicholas as Jared did destroy the research, leading Nicholas to point the finger at Youssef, telling the general that the seeds had actually been ready for weeks, but Youssef sold out to the Americans, and that's why he ordered Jared to destroy the research. Just then, the bucket falls and the lab blows up, corroborating the story that it was all a setup by Youssef. The general orders Nicholas, Shannon, and Youssef taken away, but fortunately Max and Grant have become soldiers, allowing the five to leave unmolested. Mission accomplished. I'm going to give this episode a grade of B, maybe kind of on the border of B-. I like it. I think it is a really enjoyable episode. I think that one of the best things about it is definitely the way that right from the beginning, we have that opening sequence, which is very tantalizing and kind of sets the tone for the episode. I think it's really good in terms of kind of capturing the viewer and saying, oh, wow, what's going to happen with this? Because, there's Jared, who's obviously in a lot of trouble because of the radiation that he's encountered. This lovely lady Laurel, who's dead, and this mysterious guy Youssef. It's like, okay, I'm interested. So I like the way that kind of sets up the action for the rest of the episode, and the story is good enough that you definitely want to kind of see how it plays out. It's also I think it's a good screenplay as well, not just a story, and it really does kind of keep the viewer wanting to stay with the episode. So kudos to the writers and producers for that. I liked Richie Singer as Youssef K. He's really fun and fun to watch, and really makes this episode. I've commented that so many episodes really do depend on the quality of the villain. And, it's very rare, certainly in season 2, I don't think there's any, villains who are really, really, really good in terms of completely avoiding all 3 kisses of death. But at the very least, I appreciate when we have villains who, show that formidability at least, and are not pushovers. And I'll talk more about the character of Youssef K later. But definitely, great job by Richie Singer in his portrayal of him. Another thing that I really liked about this episode was the very clever way that they structured the plot and the story to allow Thao Penglis to actually play himself, play the character himself, and not be cast as a mask, which would happen so often in the original series, and has happened quite a bit in the revival as well. It reminds me of the episode from the original series in season 5 called The Field, if you recall that one. That was another one where the story was structured where Paris, Leonard Nimoy at the time, had to impersonate a guy in order to accomplish the mission. But because it happened to be somebody, at least this is how they did it for the purposes of the story, it happened to be a guy who was not known by the people at the military base where he had to infiltrate. It could be Leonard Nimoy. It didn't have to be another actor. And the same kind of technique is used here. I like it, especially when there's a foundation for it, and they make it part of the story, and they actually explain that, okay, here's how they don't explain it explicitly, but it makes sense that, okay, he doesn't need to wear a mask, he doesn't need to be played by another actor, and that's really, really good here. Another thing alongside that, allowing Nicholas Valpenglis to become Jared is the fingerprint lifting that Grant was able to do. That was very cool. That the IMF anticipated that Youssef K was going to check to make sure it really was Jared, and they were able to pass the test by using that. Very, very neat. Other things I found that were neat about this episode, when Shannon is doing the switch of the seeds and then gets trapped in the radiation unit, there's a little bit of this kind of tense, piano music, with not too loud, not too soft, dun, 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 and that it elevates the tension a little bit. It gives a right kind of feel to that part of the episode. I liked that. Unusual that we have that kind of music, especially for an episode. So when it works and works well like this, I really want to point that out. Another thing I found neat, the way that this is a very old school plan. This is a kind of plot and IMF plan that we saw fairly frequently in seasons 2 and 3. A lot of the time, you'll recall, there would be episodes where we had Rollin and Cinnamon, Martin Landau and Barbara Bain, working the mark or the target from one angle, so that the rest of the team, Willie and Barney, could do the actual grunt work, the physical work required by the mission. And Jim would be kind of a wild card. He could be on one side or the other, depending on what the plot demanded. And this reminds me a lot of those plots. And I'll talk about that a little bit more when I get to the callbacks. A note I wanted to make, it's kind of, I don't know whether to call it kind of good or bad, but it's another one of those it is what it is things. About the scene where Shannon actually gets trapped in that radiation unit. It's a plot contrivance, and in many episodes I've commented about scenes like that where the writers and producers use those sorts of things as kind of, fake suspense because there's not too much else in the story, and this sort of thing provides some meat to the story. I don't think that that's the case here. In this case, it actually makes some sense. It's not something that just kind of happens out of the blue. It is actually logical as part of the plot. A proper foundation was laid. So this is not just like an excuse contrivance because there's not much else in the episode. Also, the way that they got out of it, it's not like it often happens where, there's this fake suspense, and then after the commercial break, there's just a simple thing. The IMF explains their way out of it, or something happens, or, somebody enters a room and that's where the suspense comes from, and then they leave the room just as quickly, and then the suspense dissipates. Here, Nicholas actually has to go through some steps and maneuver around the other people that are in the vicinity in order to save Shannon. So I actually liked that sequence, and I think it was good as a suspense and a plot device. Talking about Youssef K, the villain himself, he's definitely engaging, as I mentioned. I also don't feel that he's lame because, even though he's fairly predictable and kind of, he's got kind of a one-track mind, it's it's explicable because his situation is pretty dire. He's playing a dangerous game with his government because he's promised something and now he's in a position that he has to deliver. He does become a little bit of a schmuck at the end, though, but it's forgivable, I think, because the IMF does quite a number on him, and it's not something that just kind of falls into their lap. They have to do work in order to take him down. It reminds me very much of, from a few episodes ago, General Robard in Target Earth, if you remember that one. Same kind of thing. He was a good villain because he was engaging, he wasn't lame, he gave off the right aura of formidability, not a pushover. Yes, the IMF does bring him down. He does get schmuckified a little bit, but that's again because the IMF pull off a good plot on him and a good plan. A couple of things that I noticed that weren't very great. When we're looking around the military compound, some of the labels are in both English and Arabic, and I will say that the Arabic is pretty correct. I can read it obviously, and like for the high octane fuel, they label it as benzene, which is not technically correct, but whatever. At least it's some kind of chemical in there, and it wasn't too bad. What I didn't like is that some of the labels were just English, and that was kind of dumb. Like for example, the disc that says personnel files. That's a bit of a stretch that there wouldn't be some Arabic written on that, probably with the marker. You probably wouldn't be able to print it on a label, perhaps, but it would probably be written with a marker. And there are other examples of that, of signs around the place, even within the lab, where the signs are just in English, not in Arabic. The inconsistency kind of bothered me a little bit. Some bigger things, though, that's kind of a nit, but these things are actually things that are strikes against the episode. First of all, the trial and the ending act, that comes across as being pretty abrupt. I don't think that the writers, despite putting together a good story, they really kind of didn't land the ending. It all happens way too quickly for my liking. And it's kind of part and parcel of the fact that, they put together a story for that first 40 television minutes that did have a fair bit of meat to it. And it was a good story. But, I don't know. I wish they had left a little bit more time maybe for the ending, or just made it not seem so abrupt. But as I said, they did put a lot of effort in getting to that point. It's kind of like the episode from last season of the revival, The Lions, where the great story keeps us captivated all the way through, but all of a sudden we get to the end, and the writers are like, oh well, we have to end this somehow, and it just seemed kind of abrupt and almost like an afterthought. Sadly, it's not great when a good story just doesn't kind of come together at the end. And that's why I think I have to give this a lower grade. Ordinarily, I'd give it an A for a great story, but the ending does bring it down. Also, something that concerned me. The IMF is a little bit callous when it comes to some of the people involved here. Yes, they have to destroy the laboratory. I get it. And there's going to be some kind of collateral damage, I suppose. But, poor Mukta, poor Ismahan. Did the IMF just kind of not care about them at all? They just kind of left them to die in that lab. It's a little bit weird. I guess they're like, well, we have to complete the mission and we're focused on that. And if there's some collateral damage along the way, well, so be it. Whatever. Just seemed a little bit weird to me at the way that kind of shook out. I'll end this by talking about callbacks, as I mentioned. I mentioned the field from season 5 for the technique of allowing one of the actors to play, use their own face basically for the episode, as opposed to being cast as a mask when they're impersonating another person. So good on the writers for that. One of the episodes that this definitely reminds me of from the original series is from season 2, the episode called The Phoenix. And that one you remember for the obvious reason.
Prohas lives!
Yes, Prohash definitely lives. And maybe he's kind of been reincarnated as Youssef K. Because I see a lot of similarities between the two characters and the two plots. In the episode The Phoenix, Prohash had kind of obtained this valuable alloy that he had hidden in a sculpture and all that. So he had this very kind of elaborate plan that he was going to use in order to kind of reestablish his power. And he was a very lively and animated character that really, that again captivated the audience, and you wanted to see what happens to this guy, and you're interested in seeing the IMF take him down. Youssef K in this episode is very much the same way. Like Prohash, he's playing that kind of dangerous game. It ends up biting him in the end because the IMF is able to maneuver things so that the villain gets discredited right at the end at the most critical time. Also, as I mentioned, that kind of 3+2 old school plan. In The Phoenix, I mentioned that that's exactly what happened. Rollin and Cinnamon worked Prohash on one side, more of a distraction play or a misdirection play, and Jim also got involved on that side, allowing Willie and Barney to do the work of actually completing the mission. In this case, Nicholas and Shannon are working Youssef K from one angle, gathering information so that Max and Grant and Jim, to some extent, can complete the actual physical work involved in completing the mission. So that I think is a really good callback for this one. And I think that's what I have to say. The better episodes really don't have as much discussion as the not so great episodes, because those ones, it's easy to come up with negative stuff to dissect. But anyway, I'll leave it at that for this one. Thank you guys, as always, for watching. Please like this review video. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And please continue to leave your comments about this and other episodes. We've got 5 left before the end. There's probably going to be another best of that will be coming up in the next little while as well. Thank you again for watching, and